not all health-related data is regulated by HIPAA. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Privacy Professional Training. My name is Fumi Owolabi and I'm the founder of this training session. In this video, we're going to be focusing on Domain 2 of the Certified Information Privacy Professional Exam for the United States. Now, this is an offering from the IAPP, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. So what I really wanted to talk about today is what Domain 2 is about. So the exam was actually recreated, or some of the domains were moved for the CIPPUS in 2025. So the Domain 2 that we're going to be focusing on is the federal privacy laws in the United States. Now, if you go back to the video that I created on Domain 1, you know that the laws in the United States are fragmented, meaning that as opposed to other geographies, there is no one comprehensive federal privacy legislation. And as you continue studying for the CIPPUS exam, Domain 2 is basically where the structure of US privacy laws become very clear in order to assist you with studying for your test. And unlike other jurisdictions, like I'd mentioned, that have a comprehensive privacy legislation, in the US, we look at privacy on lots of different levels to include the federal level, which is what this video is going to be about. So there are a lot of different federal privacy laws. In this domain, you're going to encounter federal laws related to healthcare, children, education, and there are a number of other different federal privacy laws that you're going to encounter or see in the course of your studies. And the United States traditionally uses a sector-based approach to the federal laws, and then also activity. So in that fragmentation on a federal level, we look at sector and then we also look at activity. There are different types of laws that apply to data, industry, and then risks. So when you're working through Domain 2, you really want to be thinking about what the questions are addressing. If there's discussion about a specific company, you want to be looking at what type of company is it associated with. Is it a healthcare company? Is it a company that's associated with educational products for children? And instead of memorizing the statutes, think about developing a habit of analysis. You need to be identifying who is being regulated, what type of personal data is involved, which law could apply, and which agency enforces it. Because from a fragmented perspective, each federal law is enforced by a different entity. You need to be able to coincide and understand which entity is associated with which law. So let's talk a little bit about the Federal Trade Commission, and that's addressed in Domain 2. So one foundational concept in Domain 2 is the role of the Federal Trade Commission in privacy and data security enforcement. And you're going to come across the FTC a lot, especially when you're studying for the CIPPUS exam. And essentially, the Federal Trade Commission doesn't administer a comprehensive federal privacy statute. And what's relied on by the FTC is basically Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act. And in this act, it basically prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices. And this general phrasing covers privacy in context, and it's often used in situations where an organization may, let's say, for example, hasn't put specific notices in its privacy practices or has made inaccurate or misleading statements about its data practices, or it could be another situation where it's failed to implement reasonable safeguards protecting personal information. You really have to clue into what the question is asking you to be able to identify, is it going to be FTC enforcement and what is the FTC relying on? In addition to that, Domain 2 also looks at the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act of 1998, which is also known as COPPA, and is also enforced by the Federal Trade Commission. And it essentially focuses on the collection and use of children's personal data. So you can then correlate, this is the agency that regulates this federal law. From an analytical standpoint, you as a student might find it helpful to view the Federal Trade Commission as a general privacy enforcer, particularly in areas where there's no sector-specific statute that applies. There is a legal component of this for you to be able to reconcile the applicable federal law with the enforcer. And in thinking deeper about the Federal Trade Commissions, you could be reflecting on how deception often arises from voluntary representations such as privacy policies and notices or marketing practices, while unfairness can exist even without an explicit promise. So it may also be useful to consider how the Federal Trade Commission evaluates internal governance failures like a lack of oversight or training of employees, rather than focusing on only isolated incidents. Now, this is helpful in explaining why enforcement actions often emphasize ongoing compliance programs, and there may be situations where you'll encounter the need for an ongoing compliance program, but you need to take a look very carefully during your studies. Now, another thing that's addressed in Domain 2 is healthcare privacy, and this is a major component of Domain 2. And in this domain, when you're doing your studies, you need to be looking at the primary federal law, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. So most of you might be familiar with this. If you've ever been to the doctor, they might have you sign a couple of forms. It's HIPAA really looks into the processing of that personal data. And essentially it applies only to covered entities and business associates. So HIPAA includes multiple regulatory components, one of which is most notably the privacy rule and then also the security rule. You need to be able to understand the distinction and addressing the different obligations related to personal data. So really taking a look at what does the privacy rule state, what does the security rule state, reconciling it together and then looking at the enforcer. And in Domain 2, you'll also encounter the Health Information and Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act of 2009, also known as HITECH, and the 21st Century Cures Act of 2016. And essentially what this does is it expands the enforcement authority and patient access rights. And in addition to this, something that you'll see during your studies is the confidentiality of substance use disorder patient records rule. And what this rule does is it imposes heightened confidentiality protections for certain sensitive records. So you're going to need to be able to distinguish between health records and then also if there are certain sensitive records that clarify or qualify under that confidentiality law. A recurring thing that I think is valuable to discuss in Domain 2 is that not all health-related data is regulated by HIPAA. So when you're doing the studies for this, it's going to require careful analysis of the scope and context. Take a really deep look at the data that is associated with a question before you determine that HIPAA is what applies. Now, considering certain concepts such as what constitutes protected health information, the minimum necessary standard, and the distinction between treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. It could also be helpful to reflect on why some categories of health data receive stronger protections than others, because if you're able to distinguish between those that are considered more sensitive and high risk, you're going to be able to address questions that discuss either federal health regulation. Another valuable discussion for Domain 2 is the financial sector and the privacy associated with the laws from a federal perspective. So we're looking at regulation in the financial services sector. Some of the relevant statutes here that you're going to encounter during your studies: the Fair Credit Reporting Act of 1970, also known as the FCRA, and the Fair and Accurate Credit Transactions Act of 2003, also known as FACTA. And essentially this focuses on credit reporting accuracy, consumer access, and identity theft prevention. So another federal privacy legislation in the financial sector is the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act of 1999, and it essentially governs how financial institutions collect, use, and safeguard customer information. So you need to be able to make the distinction between each of these federal laws and when they apply. With respect to the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, this includes both privacy and security obligations, and you'll see those themes being consistent, not just on the federal level, but state level and industry level too. And something that's discussed frequently is the GLBA privacy rule and the GLBA safeguards rule. So you need to be able to understand the distinction between both of those as well. In addition to this, you're also going to see the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform. You really need to be able to pin down when each federal privacy law applies, right? And also you need to understand the role of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in its financial privacy oversight. So we talked a little bit about the FTC, but you also need to know about the CFPB. And something that you might find useful to think about is how the distinction between a consumer and a customer affects obligations of a business under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. So making that distinction very clear when you draft your notes is going to be really helpful. And then also understanding a permissible purpose. And purpose is a very key foundational privacy concept that is a recurring theme amongst lots of privacy examinations. So the ideas behind the financial sector highlight that financial privacy law emphasizes accuracy, fairness, and risk mitigation. And these are themes I've talked about in other videos on this channel. So you really need to key those in when you're thinking about the different federal laws. In the next video, we're going to be talking about other federal laws that you're going to encounter in Domain 2 during the course of your studies. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in another one.